The December air bit through Gabriel Sterling's coat, as if it wanted to take something more than his warmth. He had spent the evening in a boardroom lit by LEDs and applause, a world of polished surfaces and confident projections. Success smelled like cologne and closing deals. It did not smell like pine or coal smoke or the small, sharp breath of a child in the dark. He had told himself he liked the quiet on nights like this. No after-dinner arguments, no sticky fingerprints on glass. But tonight, the quiet felt like the hollow side of a room. He walked through the park because the city's lights made the snow look deliberate, like someone had staged the world to make him feel smaller. He kept his hands in his pockets, felt the empty space where a call might have been. His calendar was full for tomorrow, for next week. His life had been engineered down to neat blocks of time. He had not expected anything to interrupt the plan. A voice stopped him. It was small, steady, and oddly formal, as though the boy had practiced politeness to keep fear at bay. "Excuse me, sir," the voice said. Gabriel turned and saw a child no taller than a lamppost, mud on his shoes, a wool cap too big for his head. He clutched something to his chest, wrapped in a thin blanket that had seen better winters. The blanket thinned at the edges. It did not look like enough. The baby's face was pale and still. Breath came in shallow puffs. A thin line of tears had frozen on the boy's cheek. The park lights haloed the child's small fingers as they gripped the blanket. The boy's eyes met Gabriel's, wide, fierce, and begging for an answer that was larger than either of them. Gabriel's first thought was the wrong one. There is a security protocol, a public figure. Do not create a scene. Then the second thought arrived like an animal. The baby's lips were tinged blue. There was no time for policies. There was only decision. He tried to find a root of steel he did not know he had. Gabriel unbuttoned his cashmere coat. Expensive, soft, the kind of thing that had always felt like armor, and wrapped it around the two of them. The fabric closed around the baby and the boy like a makeshift shelter. The heat from his body went to them first. The chill bit whatever space remained. He felt the baby's tiny chest against his own coat and the fragile pulse under the blanket. He felt the boy's arm against his ribs, the boy who had the courage to knock on a stranger's life and ask for help. "Can you walk?" Gabriel asked. His voice was low. He kept it careful, small. "We'll get you warm, and then we'll call for help." The boy's name was Timothy, though he answered to Tim, brittle with age and will. His voice came out like a promise. "My sister. Her name is Sarah. She's so cold." They moved through the snow. Gabriel's shoes slipped on packed ice. The world tilting made everything more urgent. Each step felt heavy with potential and consequence. He had money, cars, a world that bent to meetings and shareholders, but none of that could change the temperature on a child's breath. He could pay for anything later, not now. At the building he managed to get them into, the doorman, Marcus, took in the scene. Snow matted in their hair, the huge coat wrapped around two small bodies, and called for an ambulance even as he opened the door. "We're on our way," Marcus said to Gabriel, calm, efficient. Marcus's hands were steady, the kind of hands that had dealt with people at their worst and their most ordinary. He understood triage. He knew how to hold space. Gabriel waited under a dripping awning as his entire life shrank to two shivering forms inside his coat. He had called security before stepping into the night. A reflex, someone should know where he was. But no one had expected him to be a rescuer. It felt oddly natural and foreign at the same time. He had no plan for what would come next. He only had a decision, to stay with them and keep them warm, or to keep walking to his carefully scheduled life and leave the boy to the cold. He stayed. He wrapped his arms tighter. He felt shock, then action, and it steadied him. An ambulance arrived minutes later, a small eternity in a December park. The paramedics took Sarah with practiced urgency, warming packs, oxygen, a voice that was clinical and loving at once. Gabriel watched as Dr. Richardson, who had arrived with the ambulance and moved with a weary expertise, checked the baby's temperature, placed her on a stretcher, and listened to the small, brave lungs. "Hypothermia," he said quietly to Gabriel, not accusing, only factual. "We can stabilize her." "We'll take her to the hospital." Detective Chen arrived at the ambulance parking at Gabriel's request. Someone had to talk to the boy, to gather facts, to make sure nothing criminal lay behind the scene. Detective Chen's presence made the night feel less like a private rescue and more like the start of something official, which it was. She knelt to meet Tim at eye level, the way professionals do so children don't feel smaller. Her questions were clear and gentle. The boy spoke in clipped sentences. The mother's name, Diane. No other adults. He had stayed awake and kept the baby awake because he was afraid of what might happen if she slept. He said he had snuck out, that he knew too much and not enough at the same time. When the ambulance doors closed and the siren faded, the park was a room that felt a little emptier. Gabriel's hands still smelled faintly of cashmere. He had wrapped himself around 2 lives and had found, for the first time in years, that he felt the pull to something that could not be scheduled. The paramedics took the baby and the boy to the emergency room. Gabriel rode in the back seat of the ambulance, his suit dusted with snow, his breath fogging in the sterile air. He offered nothing more than his name and the address, but in that small exchange the trajectory of his night and his life changed. At the emergency department, Dr. Richardson worked swiftly. Sarah's core temperature had dropped low enough to require intervention. The team warmed her gradually, monitored her heart, and gave her fluids. Gabriel sat in the corridor like a man in a foreign embassy, waiting, listening, hands folded. He realized he could not remember the last time he had sat with a child in a hospital corridor, and not with a sense of obligation to a business errand. This was something else entirely, responsibility that reached beyond contracts. Detective Chen and a child protective worker arrived to take statements. They were meticulous and kind. Because the boy had named his mother and had been the one to come for help, the situation was treated as an emergency response to neglect. No person present suggested malicious intent beyond the absence that had left the children exposed. When Dr. Richardson finally emerged from the treatment room, his expression was steady. "She's responding to warming," he said. "We'll keep her monitored for a few hours. The boy is awake but exhausted. We'll get them out of here once medical signs are stable and we've coordinated with social services." Gabriel heard the words and felt the world feel more solid. He thought about leaving, about calling his assistant Maria to cancel the next morning's meetings. He thought about the slick exchange of his life and how something in him had shifted. Some lever that had been dulled by spreadsheets now clicked. He had a home that was warm, enough resources to give them stability and, importantly, time. He could step into an unknown role. He could be useful. A child protection officer introduced herself as Mara from the city's social services. She explained the options. In cases like this, her voice said, children could be placed with a relative, a family friend, or in foster care depending on safety and suitability. Emergency protocols allowed temporary placement with a responsible adult at the scene, if background checks and documentation could be arranged quickly. Otherwise, the children could be placed in the care of protective services. But any placement would need follow-up, home visits, and legal authorization. No one's decision was permanent tonight. Gabriel answered Mara's questions, signed the forms that allowed him to be considered as an emergency caregiver, and agreed to a home visit. Detective Chen and Mara coordinated to locate the mother, Diane, whose phone number Tim had given. It did not take long for the system to find her. Someone with records, someone living in a shelter nearby. Diane was found, visibly disoriented and in the grip of an addiction that had been steadily dismantling her days. She was taken to a nearby hospital to be evaluated and to begin what the officers hoped would be an entry into treatment. No easy lines, only complicated threads that would take time to untangle. As the night rounded into early morning, a social worker named Ruth drove Gabriel and the children home, so that he could begin the temporary placement while the appropriate legal steps were prepared. The children were quiet in the car. Tim's hands gripped the edge of the seat until his knuckles paled. The baby, Sarah, slept wrapped in gentle blankets. At Gabriel's apartment, the heat felt like an apology. The apartment was functional, tasteful minimalism that had no child-sized corners. Gabriel put the coat that had been a literal and symbolic shield on the back of a chair. He made tea he did not drink. He called Maria, his assistant, and asked her to postpone everything. "Call my team. Say I'll be out for a few days," he said, the words tasting unfamiliar. Maria didn't ask questions. She trusted the sound in his voice. She said she would arrange for someone to be there tomorrow to help with childcare logistics and PR. And then she hesitated and said, "Do you want me to call the nanny you used that one summer?" Gabriel thought of a different life, one where he had learned to change diapers, where sing-alongs had interrupted conference calls. He said yes before he could let his pride set boundaries. Mrs. Chen arrived the next morning. Mrs. Chen, a retired nanny with decades of experience and a recent recommendation from Maria. She smelled of lavender and had eyes that could make a schedule feel like a warm hand. She moved around the apartment like someone who had known children all her life. She set a ritual in place, a slow feeding for Sarah, a steady breakfast for Tim. She taught Gabriel where to hold the baby, how to check for warmth, how to coax a shy appetite into an empty mouth. She did not scold him for being new. She guided. Gabriel practiced. He fumbled with a bottle and then, with patient coaching, learned to make formula at the right temperature. He learned to swaddle, to hum a tune under his breath as he paced the living room. The first night he rocked Sarah until his arms trembled. He learned how to decipher the small differences between hunger and fatigue in a baby's cry. Tim sat on the couch, watching like someone who had been watching for too long in order to survive. His trust did not arrive all at once. It braided itself slowly through shared tasks and the quiet reliability of meals and a door that locked at night. The first week was a blur of doctor's appointments, forms, and the slow, careful work of establishing a narrative that would satisfy courts, social workers, and the public that had started to take notice. A local reporter had posted an image of Gabriel outside the hospital, and within days there were questions about why a CEO had brought 2 children to his apartment, what had happened to their mother, and what would come next. Gabriel tolerated the attention badly. He had not wanted a headline. He had wanted warmth. Detective Chen, steady and discreet, became a quiet ally. She traced Diane's steps, gathered records, and helped organize contact information for relatives or potential guardians. She did not judge. She recorded. "We need to know who else is in their lives," she told Gabriel. "We need to make sure we honor the law and their safety." The law, with its patient, slow machinery, required paperwork and checks, evaluations and impressionistic assessments of character. Gabriel sat for interviews. He opened his home for a home visit. A social worker walked through the apartment with a clipboard and an eye toward child-proofing. Every step required intention. Meanwhile, Sarah's health improved. Dr. Richardson continued to check on her, smiling at her when she fussed and reporting steady gains to Gabriel, in a way that suggested small miracles were really small steps of proper medical care. Rising temperature, better color, stronger breath. "Babies are resilient," he said, but he added the necessary caveat. They also need time and consistent care. Tim melted a little as routines took hold. He began to eat with less suspicion and started to sleep for longer stretches. At night, he would sit at the foot of the bed while Gabriel checked monitors and adjusted blankets. They learned each other's rhythms. The boy learned that Gabriel would not leave in the middle of the night to a meeting. Gabriel learned that sometimes a child's needs were more immediate than any quarterly report. Gabriel's daughter, Emma, had been with her mother that holiday weekend. Gabriel called and asked her to come for a visit once things had settled. When she arrived, a small, curious person with a backpack and a question in her eyes, the apartment expanded. Emma was 8, a mix of his features and someone else's temper. She took to Sarah with a tenderness that surprised him. She wanted to feel the baby's tiny fingers and asked to sing to her. Tim watched with a guarded interest at first, then edged closer as Emma took his hand and showed him a sticker she usually kept for special occasions. In that moment, the apartment felt less like a project and more like a small, real family. As days went into weeks, Gabriel's world reoriented. He began to block his calendar not out of showmanship, but out of necessity. Board meetings were rescheduled. He learned to accept that doing some things poorly but present was better than doing everything perfectly and absent. Maria negotiated his messages and sternly protected his time. the way good assistants do for their employers when the employer is trying to be brave at the edges of their life. She found a part-time pediatric therapist for Tim, a family counselor for supervised visits with Diane, and someone to help with the paperwork that would, eventually, bring them before a judge. Diane's path back was uneven. She was in detox and medical care, an unstable past battered by addiction that had been a slow thief in the household. When she first met Gabriel's, months after the night in the park, she was raw and ashamed. Her eyes avoided the small ones she had carried, and sometimes could not even locate. When they did meet, it was in a neutral room under the supervision of a social worker. She spoke in fragments, then longer sentences. She was not easy to summarize. She loved her children, she said, and she had failed them by letting dependency swallow the rest. She was not a villain. She was someone made small by a disease that had complicated her ability to keep the promises she had made as a parent. The first face-to-face meeting with Diane was guarded. She could not be left alone with the children until she had demonstrated sustained sobriety and completed programs. The social worker explained this. "It's about safety," Mara said. "It's about giving her a chance to earn her place back." Diane nodded like someone learning to read again. Gabriel watched the meeting and felt many things: anger, compassion, the weight of the system that was trying not to punish her for being ill, but to protect the children. As the city's news cycle brushed their story, one headline about a compassionate stranger, another about systemic failures, Gabriel's phone buzzed with messages he did not want to answer. A PR narrative formed around him without his consent. A CEO playing saint. He felt the edges of exploitation and tried to pull his life back into private lanes. Maria dealt with calls professionally. Gabriel asked that the family's privacy be respected. Detective Chen gently reminded him that while public interest had a life of its own, the court would scrutinize more than headlines. "We'll let the process be what it needs to be," she said. "Publicity won't help the children in court. Your consistency will." The process moved forward with patient, excruciating slowness. Social services conducted home visits, examining his space for child safety. Background checks had to be completed. The courts required that any transfer of custody be grounded in the child's best interests, not a single heroic act. Gabriel accepted the delay, learning that jumping to fix everything in a single night was not how systems that protect children worked. He found purpose in the small repetitive tasks that cumulatively mattered. Taking Tim to therapy every Thursday, reading Sarah a bedtime story every night, learning to tie tiny shoelaces and to treat a fever with calm. At one home visit, the social worker pointed out more than deficiencies. The sturdiness of the crib, the presence of extra blankets, Gabriel's willingness to arrange for childcare. "You're learning," she said. "That's what matters." He felt the words differently from approval. They were, instead, markers of growth. He began to measure himself not by metrics of profit, but by minutes spent teaching Tim how to ride a bike without fear. Court day came after months of reports, evaluations, and supervised visits. The courtroom itself felt small and important, like a chapel of civic responsibility. Gabriel sat in a suit that had once symbolized his armor. Today, it felt simply like clothing. The gallery held a few faces. The social worker, Dr. Richardson, with a neutral nod, Detective Chen with a copy of her report, and a man from the foster agency who had come at Mara's request. Diane appeared in court, thinner and quieter, flanked by a counselor who had guided her recovery. Tim sat beside Gabriel, feet dangling, making small circles in the carpet with the toe of his shoe. Sarah sat in a child carrier, rubbing at her eyes. She was older in ways that had nothing to do with years. The judge asked questions that were direct and deliberate. Was Gabriel stable? Did he have the capacity and willingness to care for the children long-term? Could Diane be rehabilitated, and if so, would reunification be possible and safe? The system did not rush to sever a mother from her children. It sought, when possible, to reintegrate and restore. But it also understood the reality that recovery does not always align with a child's developmental window. Gabriel spoke when asked why he wanted guardianship. He could have read a legal argument. Instead, he spoke from where the work had been done, nights awake, endless small tasks, the long patient learning of how to be necessary. "I don't want a headline," he said, voice steady. "I want to be a place of safety for these children. The night in the park was the first time I acted. I don't expect credit. I expect to be accountable." His words were not perfect. They did not have the soft eloquence of a speechwriter. They had under them the weight of someone who had changed his priorities and had learned to say what matters. The judge granted temporary legal guardianship to Gabriel, with conditions: continued oversight by social services, regular reports on the children's well-being, and continued supervised visitation for Diane as she progressed through her treatment program. The decision was not a final severing. It was a careful step meant to secure safety while honoring the possibility of family restoration. It gave Gabriel authority to make daily decisions, but also required him to keep records and participate in family planning. In the months that followed, life as a guardian felt like constant balancing. Gabriel found himself answering the same question, why him, more often than he expected. Some critics on social media argued that a man of privilege had performed a good deed and bought public affection. Others elevated him into a near-mythic figure, which made him uncomfortable. The truth, messy, slow, human, was more complicated. He had been in the right place at the right time and had chosen to act. He had also learned through repeated error and instruction how to be present. He learned to do mundane things, how to soothe a screaming child without panic, how to negotiate the bureaucracy of benefits and school enrollments, how to install a car seat properly. He learned patience in different cadences, the quiet patience of a child learning to sleep through the night, the long patience of a person in recovery, the institutional patience of quarterly reports and home visits. Tim's therapy was a slow, careful dance. He attended sessions with a therapist named Dr. Patel, who used play to help him name feelings and to find language for fear. Tim began to trust adults more. He learned that it was okay to be upset. He learned that being steadfast mattered. He asked questions, hard ones, about why his mother had left and why the world sometimes felt dangerous even when it was safe. Gabriel answered as honestly as he could without putting undue burden on the boy. He told him things a child needed to know, that adults sometimes fail, that help is available, that Tim was not alone. Diane's progress was him and the system rubbing against each other in slow cooperation. She completed a medically supervised detox and entered into a structured recovery program. The first few months, visits with her were supervised, short, awkward, heavy with emotion. Diane brought drawings she had made for the children, hands clumsy with pen. She apologized more than once, and her apologies were not empty. She attended therapy, group sessions, and slowly began to speak of plans, housing, a way to manage triggers, a desire to rebuild a life that could hold her children. There were relapses, small slips that served as fearful reminders of how fragile recovery can be, and there were victories when she took responsibility for the steps she needed to take. Through all of this, Gabriel was learning something he had not anticipated: the capacity to love without ownership. He had been alone in a suite of triumphs for years. Now his days were punctuated by small, blessed calamities: a spilled bottle, a lost shoe, a school recital that made him cry behind sunglasses. These things were disorienting and, in their own quiet way, life-saving. He found his identity shifting, less tied to quarterly growth and more to nightly readings and scraped knees. Maria managed the less romantic parts of their lives. She arranged for Mrs. Chen to come more regularly. She managed interviews with careful boundaries. She found resources for Diane and coordinated with the social worker when formal documents were needed. She also reminded Gabriel, sometimes with gentle bluntness, that he could not do everything alone. He had to build a support network. He listened. The months brought routines. Emma helped with bedtime stories and with choosing outfits for Sarah. She taught Tim how to make paper airplanes, and, in doing so, learned to share snacks without counting them like currency. The apartment accumulated children's things: tiny socks, cheerful drawings, a fortress of pillows behind the couch. Gabriel found himself buying a second car seat and sweating the right installation. He came to appreciate that care was, at its core, a sequence of tiny investments. Outside, the media cycle slowed. The initial storm of interest gave way to a calmer acknowledgement. Some people still argued about motives. Others used the story as a prompt to talk about systemic gaps in child welfare. A local charity reached out and offered support for therapy costs. Gabriel politely declined the part of the spotlight, but accepted help where it mattered. "I didn't do this for praise," he said once to a reporter, who printed the line almost verbatim. He regretted the simplicity of that headline, for the truth was more nuanced. He had acted because not acting was impossible for him in that moment. The rest was the hard work of living out that first impulse with care and patience. A year after that cold night, Diane faced a choice that would reshape not only her life but the children's. She had been through sustained treatment, housing assistance, and vocational training. She had done substantial work and, for the first time, could imagine life without the grip of substance dependence. In private sessions, her counselors asked the question no one could answer for her. Was she ready to resume full custody? Would reunification be in the children's best interests, given their need for stability, or would it risk their fragile progress? Diane's decision did not come from compulsion. In a meeting with her social worker, she spoke with a clarity that surprised everyone. "I love them," she said, voice even. "I will always love them. I have tried to be what they needed and failed because of my illness. I could spend years proving I'm fit, and maybe someday," she paused, "maybe someday I will be. But I can see that they need consistency now, and I can't, yet, promise that." She wiped a hand across her face. "I don't want my love to be the thing that keeps them from thriving. I want them to have what they need." No one had forced her hand. No one had shamed her. The decision that followed was not a fairy tale release. It was a labor of love and grief. Diane voluntarily relinquished her parental rights, a wrenching, inconceivably hard choice made in the interest of her children's welfare. It was an act of love that acknowledged limitations and privileged the children's stability over a parent's desire to be present before she was ready. The judge, after a thorough review and sensitive hearings that took into account Diane's progress and the children's best interests, granted permanent guardianship to Gabriel. The order formalized what months of caregiving had already made true. The children had a home with someone who consistently met their needs. The order was accompanied by an injunction for ongoing support for Diane, ensuring she would not be left without resources or community. There was no villainy here, only complex human beings trying to do right by one another. The day the papers were signed, the apartment felt like a small field of light. Emma had made tiny paper crowns. Tim had drawn a picture of a treehouse. Sarah, newly an undisputed citizen of the family with cheeks that had the healthy roundness of a child, nourished not only by milk, but by presence, stretched in Gabriel's lap and yawned. Gabriel held the coat that had started it all, the cashmere jacket that had been an immediate reaction in a park, and placed it on the back of a chair like a relic. It had done more than warm bodies that night. It had warmed a soul. People asked Gabriel in later interviews if the night in the park had changed his life. He would say, simply, yes. He would say that he had learned how to make formula at 3 a.m, how to answer a question about hurting in a way that did not lull a child into silence, how to be patient with someone in recovery. He would say that the work of family required work, not romance. It required patience, legal counsel, therapy, and community support. He would say that while headlines could fade, routines do not. Routines make you better, slowly. Detective Chen attended the adoption hearing as a quiet witness, nodding at the right places. Dr. Richardson came with a small handmade card Sarah was too young to appreciate, but that the adults around her did. Mara from Social Services brought a cake. Maria stood by Gabriel's side, practical and proud. Chen, who had become a constant, framed her hands and smiled like someone seeing the result of a life spent helping others. On a sunny afternoon, months after the court's decision, the family gathered in a modest backyard that the city had lent them for a community picnic. Children ran with sticky faces, and the world felt ordinary and miraculous at once. Emma taught Tim how to whistle. Sarah tried to clap along. Gabriel watched, the coat folded neatly on a chair inside the house, and realized that his loneliness had not been erased by documents or adoration. It had been softened by presence, by hands that needed him, and that let him be needed back. Sometimes in the dark quiet before dawn, he would think of Diane and the complicated calculus of love and loss. He would think of her small acts of progress, an hour in a treatment group, a letter written with shaky pen thanking the social worker, a phone call where she asked simply how the children were. He called her when arrangements allowed. She was in his life in a different, less central way, a grieving, recovering parent who had chosen the children's safety as an act of love. The coat lingered as a symbol. Gabriel did not wear it often after the night in the park. It had a smell of a winter long ago and of a decision that had been both instinct and moral choice. He kept it folded in a drawer sometimes, but more often he left it draped across the back of a chair where the children could touch it, feel the softness, and ask questions about the night that had started everything. "Why do we have that coat?" Tim asked once, and Gabriel sat down and told the story in a way a child could understand. A question and a quick answer, a choice made. "A man was walking and he heard a small voice," Gabriel said simply. "He wrapped them up and brought them somewhere warm. That's how we started." The story was true, but incomplete. It omitted the legal forms and the nights of worry and the therapy appointments and the social workers who had kept watching. It omitted the relapses and the appointments Diane had kept to her promise to rebuild. But it captured what mattered for a child, a kindness that created safety. Years later, when the children were older and the apartment had the loud, delicious chaos of a lived-in home, Gabriel sometimes found himself at his desk, once a throne of profit, and drafting notes for the company. The board still wanted numbers and projections. He still gave them that. But his sense of urgency had shifted. He would not let work swallow him as it had in his earlier life. There were soccer practices now and recitals, and a child who would sometimes crawl into bed in the middle of the night, seeking comfort. When the workday bled into bedtime, he learned to log off. He had not expected to find so much fulfillment in loss of control. No story, he had learned, was perfect. The legal system remained imperfect. The city's social services were stretched thin, and funding for long-term recovery support was always at risk. But he also learned that one person's small, immediate act could create enough room for others to act with competence and care. He had wrapped his coat around 2 helpless children on a winter night, and had, in the process, wrapped himself into a family. If this story moves you, if the idea of small acts changing lives resonates, consider subscribing to hear more stories that remind us kindness still matters. The last scene is not cinematic fireworks, but a simple, human quiet. A child's drawing pinned to the refrigerator, a coffee mug half drunk on the counter, a coat hung on a peg by the door. Tim had learned to ride a bike with training wheels. Emma had become a stern negotiator of bedtime rules. Sarah, who would grow into her own steady self, slept a little better each night. Diane, steady in outpatient care and employed part-time at a community center, would visit sometimes and bring cookies, and sometimes she and Gabriel would sit across from each other and talk quietly about the past and what they both had done to make the future safer. In a way that no boardroom could measure, Gabriel had found a new metric for success. The sound of children laughing in the next room, the small peacefulness of a night when no one needed him urgently, the steady ache of love that was both thorny and exquisite. The coat that had warmed them on that first night had become a symbol of what kindness can do when followed by steadfast commitment. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that ordinary people, with ordinary courage, can change a life. Consider supporting your local child welfare organization. Donate time, money, or attention, so that the systems that protect children can work for more families like these.